How many water of crystallization molecules are there in 100 grams of FeSO4.7H2O? This .7H2O is water of crystallization. Try this yourself before I show you the answer. How many water of crystallization molecules in 100 grams of iron sulfate with water of crystallization? So we need to multiply this by a conversion factor, which has grams of iron sulfate with water of crystallization at the bottom to cancel that out. And at the top, we need water of crystallization. This is not how many grams or how many moles, but it's how many water of crystallization molecules we have inside this amount of iron sulfate. So from the periodic table, we know that the molar mass of iron sulfate with water of crystallization is 55,8 for the iron, plus 32 for the sulfur, plus we have 14 H's, it's H2 there, multiplied by 7, each one being 1 gram per mole, so that's 14. Plus, we have 4 O's there and then 7 O's there. So in total that's 11 and each one 16 grams per mole. Work that all out and we get 277,8 grams per mole. What does that mean? If we have 277,8 grams of iron sulfate, then we have 1 mole of iron sulfate with water of crystallization. The top of this conversion factor must refer to the same amount of substance as the bottom. In other words, it must also refer to 1 mole of iron sulfate with water of crystallization. So we need to ask ourselves, how many water of crystallizations are there inside 1 mole of iron sulfate? So that the top also refers to a mole of this iron sulfate. And we know that there are 7 moles of water of crystallization inside 1 mole of iron sulfate. But this is not asking for moles. This is asking for water of crystallization. So we have 7, 6,02 times 10 to the power 23 waters. If perhaps that's too many steps for you, perhaps it's a little bit complicated, let's maybe do it in 2 steps. Maybe that is easier. So let's start over. Let's again take the question, how many water of crystallizations do we have in 100 grams of iron sulfate dot 7H2O. I'm just writing it like that to save some space. Right, so let's do it in some steps here. We need grams of iron sulfate dot 7H2O at the bottom. So we can say, all right, we know from the periodic table that we have the molar mass of this iron sulfate, and as we've already seen, that is 277,8 grams per mole. Okay, so let's use that as our conversion factor. So we have 277,8 grams is the same thing as 1 mole of FeSO4.7H2O, because that's what the meaning of molar mass is. So many grams for 1 mole of that substance. 277,8 grams of iron sulfate is 1 mole of iron sulfate. So that gets rid of grams of iron sulfate for us, which is good. We needed to do that. But it introduces moles of iron sulfate, which we didn't want. We need to get rid of it. That's why we're going to have another conversion factor over here. And that has moles of iron sulfate dot 7H2O at the bottom to cancel those moles out. And it has H2O, not moles of H2O, but H2O at the top. And we know that 1 mole of iron sulfate has 7 moles of H2O. 7 moles of water is 7 times 6,02 times 10 to the power 23 water molecules. So these two methods are really the same thing. It's just that here we split this one step up into 2, which might be helpful. If it is, use it. If not, don't worry. And both answers give us the correct answer of 1,52 times 10 to the power 24 water molecules. How many moles of water molecules are there in 100 grams of iron sulfate? Answer this yourself before I show you. How many mole H2O? Notice this is now mole H2O, not just H2O. Are there in 100 grams of iron sulfate with water of crystallization? So we multiply that by a unit factor, which has grams of iron sulfate at the bottom to cancel that unit out. And we need moles of water. Now not water, but moles of water at the top. Again, we could split this into 2. We've already calculated that the molar mass of iron sulfate with water of crystallization is 277,8 grams per mole. So that means that if you have 277,8 grams of iron sulfate, that is 1 mole of iron sulfate with water of crystallization. So the bottom refers to 1 mole of this iron sulfate. Therefore, the top also has to refer to 1 mole of iron sulfate. So we have to ask ourselves, how much water of crystallization, how many moles of water of crystallization are there inside 1 mole of this iron sulfate? And we can see there's the answer. There are 7 moles of water of crystallization for every 1 mole of the whole molecule or the whole formula unit. So top and bottom refer to equivalent amounts. They're both referring to a mole of iron sulfate. The bottom is referring to the mass of that mole of iron sulfate. The top is referring to how many moles of water are inside that mole of iron sulfate. 100 times 7, 700, divided by 277,8 gives you 2,52 moles of water. Now again, we could have broken this up into 2 steps. Let's quickly do that. How many moles of water of crystallization in 100 grams of iron sulfate, which has water of crystallization in it? So let's do it in 2 steps now. We know we need grams of iron sulfate at the bottom. And what we know from the periodic table is that 277,8 grams of iron sulfate is 1 mole of iron sulfate. So that gets rid of grams iron sulfate. We're happy about that. But it introduces another unit, moles of iron sulfate, that we didn't ever want. So we have to have another unit factor to get rid of that moles of iron sulfate. We can cancel that out. Meanwhile, we really need mole of water. And we know that 1 mole of iron sulfate has 7 moles of water inside it. So can you see that these 2 steps were collapsed into this one conversion factor here, but it's exactly the same thing. We'll get the same answer, 2,52 moles of water.